herself than be thrown to these adolescent lions by an unusually merciless Jane. "Oh, heavens, I didn't push matron off a cliff and steal the waifs and strays fund from the hospital chapel, if that's what you're thinking," she said. And judging by Kitty's pop eyes and sudden little huff of relief, she had been considering something along these lines as a real possibility. Damn it, there was one who was going to have some trouble getting through her leaving certificate. "No," Elizabeth said now, in a more pacific tone, "it's a great deal less exciting than that. All I did was to pop in and visit Jane last week. On the ward." In her civvies, Jane interjected. "Caught me unawares, and if she'd been caught herself then it might have been curtains for her, here at St. Pem's." "Oh, you're a proper bad un, Lizzy," Lydia said solemnly, and there was something half admiring in it, not too surprising from this proto-malfeasant, obviously. "I'm not sure that Mama will let me associate with you any more when I tell her about it." And she squealed with laughter and Elizabeth pinged a large scone crumb at her, and then another, putting a serviette over her face to protect herself from the onslaught. Elizabeth did relent, after quite a massive fusillade, only suddenly ceased when she realized that they were being narrowly observed by the elderly waitress in the tea room. And the urge to open her mouth and say, "Well, in fact, I was apprehended, and you'll never believe by whom, Jane," was very great. She was not in the habit of keeping many secrets, certainly from Jane, and not often from even Mary. And then, oops, she had actually done so, the words were out, and could never be recalled again. "Oh dear, Lizzy," Jane said, and there was a little pause between them. Jane had such a very tragic and worried expression that Elizabeth was forced to go on, only the whole tale would provide her sister with any reassurance, although she had sore misgivings over whether it had been wise to share it in the first instance. "Now don't worry," she said firmly, as Jane opened her mouth, no doubt with 1,000 questions about the imminent disaster she was helplessly predicting in her own mind. "The fellow, well, I can't say he was very impressed, but then you couldn't reasonably expect him to be, under the circumstances. But he assured me, well, I wouldn't describe it as a solemn promise, but he did say that he wouldn't report me, and I think I can rely on that. So, you see, Jane dear, there's nothing to worry about after all, and I have most surely learnt my lesson, and won't be risking getting my collar felt again, you may be sure of it." A fellow. "That's hilarious," Lydia cried, a reaction that was sadly unsurprising in her. "Lizzy has a fellow, who would ever have thought it?" Similarly in gist, but with a rather different attitude, Jane said, "But what fellow? Lizzy, who is this man you refer to? Why, I must speak to him, I must plead your case, and tell him, Lizzy, is it someone from the hospital? Is it someone on the staff, or—" Elizabeth was left no alternative but to disclose all, then, darn it, and largely by her own folly, too. She sighed, and launched into it. "Well, Jane, I am very reluctant to say it, for I know you'll not be best pleased, and indeed we might as well buckle down for a storm, but, well, it was Mr. Darcy. I know you know full well who that is, because he popped in to visit your patient on the ward the same day that I came to visit you, and it was, just before that incident that he busted me as a scoreflaw, poking about the place looking for you in my civvies." She smiled brightly at Jane, hopeful for not too horrified a response. What she got was a low whistle, from Lydia's direction, of course. And from Jane, a hand over the eyes for a moment, and after that moment, a sigh. "Are you sure he's not going to report you?" Jane asked, and Elizabeth wished that she could make all the requisite reassurances with 100% certainty. "I'm fairly sure he won't," she compromised, which was largely true. "As far as I remember, he said I was lucky that he was too busy and had other things to do, which is true, I suppose. But I doubt he'd go back on his word, going by my own impressions of the chap, I doubt very much he'd consider me important enough to give another thought to, still less go to the trouble of reporting me." And that, yes, that was perfectly true, the very essence of her fundamental opinion on the matter. "Maybe he took a fancy to you, Lizzy," Lydia said consideringly. "You're still a bit of a looker, granted, you're getting on a bit now, but even so, you're not half bad, in a dim light, and with enough panstick on you. At this, she dived in readiness for the half-tea cake that Elizabeth lobbed in her direction, having fully expected it from the moment she opened her mouth. And Jane had too much sense to take a blind bit of notice of that, but only said, pressing her hands together and wringing them, rather, well, I'm sure it will be all right. Except, oh Lizzy, you know he's terribly high up at Pemberley's. I mean, he's only a junior consultant, I know, but… Yes, I know, Elizabeth interrupted. He's also the son and heir of the family that the entire estate used to belong to. I know it's hardly an ideal situation, Jane, but… Ideal, Jane said, with a gaspy, slightly asphyxiated laugh. But, Elizabeth continued remorselessly, I'm pretty damn sure no harm will come of it. He isn't going to concern himself with a minor nobody like a nursing probationer. Especially not when he's got better things to think about. Bear that in mind, Jane. Did you know that he was pally with poor Mr Bingley? How is the chap doing, anyhow? I hope he's improved from last week. He did look terribly poorly, poor fellow. There was really no earthly reason in the world for Jane to look quite so white and stricken at this question as she did. Are you all right, Janey? Mary asked mildly. And a solemn-faced Kitty offered her sister one of her sticky iced buns, an act of great generosity considering they were almost as much a current fixation as the heroes of her teen dream mop-topped magazines. No, thank you, I'm quite all right, bless you darling, but no, Jane said, this last to Kitty. She fumbled a little with her handkerchief, and blew her nose, avoiding Elizabeth's eyes. Oh, Bingley, she said now. He's much better, praise be. Ever so much better, in fact, they've just moved him onto the regular care ward, to keep an eye on his kidney function after the left one got banged about rather badly. But overall, he's ever so much better. So he's been moved off your ward? Elizabeth asked. She was watching Jane rather carefully, Jane, who had seemed a little off on first arrival, and still more so now, frankly. But she got no answer from her sister, who was picking apart a currant bun, and seemed completely wrapped up in that, frowning to herself and gazing down at her hands. Thus she continued, saying, I didn't realize at the time, but in any case, guess what kind of Bingley he is? The rest of the girls looked more than a little mystified, and she hurried on quickly to say, the kind that's brother to the Bingley girls I was at school with. Jane would not know nor remember Safie Hurst's face, nor the rest of the girls, for that matter, as only she had attended Lady Russell's endowed college. Because it offered, every third year, a bursary for which she was ideally suited, that would cover all extra expenses involved in her chosen career. But still, much better not to think about that now. They had all, however, heard a good many stories about the Bingley sisters. One thing that Elizabeth could not criticize about the pair, they had always provided endless material for tales, mockery, jokes and object lessons on what not to do and how not to behave. Safie Bingley visited him the same evening I popped in on you, Jane. I bumped into her out in the car park. You remember, the dreadful hockey-playing goon who thought that being prefect meant being Queen of the Sixth, and threw a fit when she wasn't voted most likely in the student magazine? Jane perked up a bit now, in fact she looked positively illuminated. Oh. Yes, I remember. Well, that explains a thing or two. Oh, well, in fact, I mean. How dreadfully guilty she looked, now. What do you mean, exactly, darling? Elizabeth inquired, tickled. Do you mean she's been the absolute worst in the world, a ward visitor from hell, and you aren't one bit surprised to find out that she's got form as an absolute monster well before now? Lydia and Kitty giggled, and although Mary tried to look rather disapproving, a little smile managed to quirk its way onto her lips. Anyhow, she's Mrs. Hurst now, Elizabeth said carelessly. And didn't she let me know it? Ooh-ee, poor old spinster Lizzy, she talked down to me about it from a great height. Isn't she the one who borrowed the princess outfit from the theatre club props department, and wore it to the school dance? Mary asked, as memories began to kindle in their minds of Elizabeth's many tales about the Bingleys, back in good old school days. and split it at the seams out on the dance floor.